Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are incredibly glad you are here with us today because we're looking at a text that essentially takes the current cultural discourse, flips it completely upside down, and subjects it to this intensely rigorous, highly controversial philosophical autopsy.
It really does. It leaves no stone unturned.
No, it doesn't. Today, you're exploring a massive, unapologetically fierce new ebook titled Credentialism Crisis: Women's False Economy of Education.
Right, written by Conrad Riker.
Yeah, exactly. Published in 2025. And I have to say, this is an ultra-long, incisive, and honestly fascinating read. We're going to spend this session breaking down its entire intellectual architecture for you.
Because it is a text of immense scope. I mean, the author has built a very comprehensive, very specific worldview here.
Yeah, and our objective today is to impartially examine exactly how he constructs his arguments. We're going to look at the claims, the biological metaphors, the historical timelines, the economic frameworks, all the pieces the author uses to build his case.
Piece by piece. And we should probably set the stage regarding exactly who this book is speaking to, right?
Good point. This deep dive is custom tailored to explore the ideological frameworks driving the modern men's rights activist, or MRA, and the red-pilled manosphere communities.
Yeah, if you want to understand the foundational arguments circulating in those spaces today, you have to look at this text.
Especially how they view the history of our institutions before they were allegedly captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies. If you want to understand that, this book is an absolute must-read.
Completely.
And hey, if you enjoy this kind of rigorous, in-depth exploration of polarizing ideas, please make sure to like and subscribe to this audio feed. We also highly encourage you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook for yourself so you can follow along with the source material.
And you can also follow the author on Substack at Conrad.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where does the author even begin to lay the groundwork for an argument of this scale?
Well, the book operates fundamentally as a declaration of war against what Riker terms the academic-industrial complex.
The academic-industrial complex.
Right. He looks at modern Western institutions, universities, corporate HR departments, the state bureaucracy, and argues that they have been structurally corrupted.
But what makes the text interesting is that he doesn't just rely on standard modern political talking points, right?
No, not at all. He builds his foundation on evolutionary biology, classical philosophy. He leans really heavily on Aristotle and Arthur Schopenhauer and Austrian economics.
It's a heavy mix.
It is. He uses these deeply established disciplines to urge what he frames as a necessary masculine rebellion. A rebellion against a system he claims is designed to extract resources from productive men.
Which brings us right to the core thesis of the book. He vividly labels this the gilded facade.
The gilded facade?
Yeah, and the central premise here is incredibly bold. He claims that female empowerment through higher education is the, quote, greatest fraud ever perpetrated upon modern civilization.
He does not hold back.
He really doesn't. He's making the case that the modern educational system is essentially a massive status game, one that produces absolutely zero economic value.
But to understand how he gets to the economics, we actually have to talk about how he uses classical logic first.
Right, because he brings up the classical trivium almost immediately.
He does. And it's essential to understand his framework. So, for anyone unfamiliar, the classical trivium was the foundation of a liberal arts education from antiquity straight through the Middle Ages.
It consists of three parts, right? Grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Exactly. And in this context, grammar isn't just about, punctuation or syntax. It's the gathering of raw, objective, immutable facts.
Okay.
Then logic is the mechanical process of connecting those facts to identify truth and eliminate contradictions.
And then rhetoric is the final step, the art of communicating and persuading others of that truth.
Precisely. So facts, then the analysis of facts, and finally the presentation.
Right. But Riker argues that modern higher education, particularly in what he calls the soft humanities, has entirely abandoned grammar and logic.
He claims universities have just skipped straight to rhetoric.
They teach students how to argue.
How to argue, how to deconstruct, how to use language to manipulate power dynamics, but without any foundation in objective, measurable reality.
And he uses that concept to build what he calls his syllogism of value. Let me make sure I'm mapping his logic correctly here.
Go for it.
Okay, so premise one is that economic value requires tangible production. In his worldview, you have to actually build a bridge or code a functional software program.
Or extract energy from the ground, or transport goods, yes.
Right. Then premise two is that the modern female educational track, specifically focusing on non-STEM grievance-based or hyper-theoretical humanities degrees, prioritizes credential accumulation over that tangible productive capacity.
Right. It's about getting the piece of paper that grants social status. It's not about acquiring a skill that actually bends the physical world to human will.
Which leads to his conclusion. This specific educational track actively destroys economic value.
Because it consumes massive resources, time, and capital, but yields nothing that keeps civilization running.
It's a fascinating, very rigid way to view economics. But he doesn't just stop at philosophy. He drags evolutionary biology into the mix.
And this leads to some of the most striking imagery in the entire text. What's fascinating here is how he applies the work of evolutionary biologist Ahmad Zahavi.
Specifically, Zahavi's handicap principle.
Right. The classic example of this principle in nature is the peacock's tail. If you think about it from a pure survival standpoint, a massive, brightly colored, heavy tail is a severe handicap.
It seems like a terrible evolutionary strategy.
It really does. It requires immense caloric energy to grow, it makes the bird highly visible to predators, and it makes it way harder to fly away.
Unless you look at it through the lens of sexual selection and status signaling.
Exactly. The tail exists to signal genetic fitness to a female mate. The peacock is essentially saying, look at this massive, expensive, dangerous burden I am carrying around.
I must have incredible genes to be able to survive despite this handicap.
Yes. And Riker takes this biological concept and maps it directly onto a useless humanities degree.
He argues that spending $100,000 in 4 years of your life to get a degree in, say, 17th century French poetry functions exactly like the peacock's tail.
That is his exact argument. It is a massive, expensive burden of student debt that signals social status and luxury.
It demonstrates to the world that you come from a background with enough resources to waste years of time on non-survival, non-productive activities.
It's a pure status flex masquerading as intellectual development.
Okay, the peacock metaphor is striking, but we have to talk about the cuttlefish.
Oh, the cuttlefish!
Because I was reading this chapter and I had to pause and reread it to make sure I was fully grasping the biological jump he's making here. He brings up what marine biologists literally call the sneaky fucker strategy.
It is a genuine, documented phenomenon in marine biology, and Riker applies it with absolute surgical precision to the modern corporate economy.
So in the ocean, cuttlefish have a highly competitive mating hierarchy.
Right, the large, aggressive alpha males fiercely guard the females. They fight off competing males. They use physical dominance to secure reproductive access.
But the smaller, weaker male cuttlefish, the ones who would instantly lose a physical fight with the alpha, they've developed a completely different strategy.
They can change their skin color to perfectly mimic the visual patterns of a female cuttlefish.
So these smaller males disguise themselves as females.
Yeah, the alpha male sees them, assumes they're just another female in his harem, and lets them pass without a fight.
And then the disguised male gains access to the actual females.
Passing on his genes without ever having to engage in the dangerous physical labor of fighting for dominance, they bypass the physical struggle entirely through mimicry and deception.
And Riker uses this to describe modern credentialed status seekers.
He claims that instead of mimicking skin color, they use academic credentials and HR buzzwords to mimic actual competence.
The argument is that they bypass the need to provide direct, tangible value, which is the metaphorical physical fight of the alpha male.
Yeah.
And instead use these deceptive credentials to gain access to resources.
Right, via government subsidies and corporate bureaucracy. They extract the wealth generated by the productive class without having to do the hard labor themselves.
Wow. And to ground these abstract concepts, the text provides a very specific, sustained anecdotal comparison. He names these two archetypes, Sarah and Dave.
Dave is presented as the archetype of the foundational masculine economy.
Right, he's a sanitation worker, or maybe a roughneck on an oil rig, or a master electrician.
He has no university degrees, but he wakes up at 4 in the morning, works a physically demanding, often dangerous job, and generates clear, measurable worth.
If Dave and his colleagues stop working, the city literally drowns in waste or loses power within days.
Exactly. Sarah, on the other hand, represents the credentialed class. She holds a master's degree and works as a social media manager or a brand consultant.
And Riker breaks down what he calls her actual economic footprint. The math he does here is crucial to understanding his worldview.
It is. He points out that Sarah might earn a gross salary of, say, $65,000 a year, but then he starts subtracting the operational costs required to sustain that specific lifestyle and career.
He calculates the cost of the nanny she needs because she's at the office.
He adds the cost of the daily lattes, the Uber rides, the expensive convenience meals or takeout because she is too emotionally exhausted from her screen-based job to cook a meal from scratch.
He even factors in the interest payments on the student loans required to get the job in the first place.
Right. And by the time he finishes the arithmetic, subtracting her operational costs from her gross revenue, Riker argues her net contribution to the household, and by extension to society, is actually negative.
He presents her career not as a necessary economic function, but as a heavily subsidized vanity hobby.
Meanwhile, Dave is out there generating the massive structural surplus that keeps the entire civilization, including Sarah's air-conditioned office, running.
If we look closely at this comparison, Riker is posing a fundamental societal question.
How did we arrive at a cultural consensus where Sarah's path, which he views as economically parasitic, is venerated as the pinnacle of success, while Dave's path, which actually sustains life, is looked down upon as low status and undesirable?
That is the perfect pivot, because he doesn't believe this was an accident. He claims this was a deliberate institutional hijacking.
He traces this ideological shift directly back to the 1960s, heavily focusing on the Frankfurt School.
Let's unpack the history here, because he throws out some major academic names. Who exactly is Herbert Marcuse, and why does this book view him as ground zero for institutional capture?
Well, the Frankfurt School refers to a group of Marxist intellectuals associated with the Institute for Social Research, originally in Frankfurt, Germany.
And during the rise of the Nazi regime, many of these thinkers fled to the U.S. and integrated into major universities.
Most notably Columbia University. Herbert Marcuse was one of its most prominent members. While classical Marxism focused on the economic struggle between the working class and the wealthy owners, Marcuse and the Frankfurt School helped pioneer critical theory,
which shifted the focus from purely economic class struggles to cultural and psychological struggles.
Exactly. And the text zeroes in on a very specific essay Marcuse wrote in 1965 called Repressive Tolerance.
Explain what Marcuse was arguing there, because Riker treats this essay like the blueprint for the death of modern academia.
In Repressive Tolerance, Marcuse argued a highly controversial point. He claimed that in a society dominated by oppressive power structures, traditional objective tolerance, meaning treating all ideas equally and letting them compete in the marketplace of ideas, actually serves to reinforce the oppressive status quo.
Okay, so therefore,
Marcuse argued that to achieve true, quote-unquote, liberating tolerance, society must actively withdraw tolerance from right-wing, conservative, or traditional movements and extend tolerance exclusively to left-wing revolutionary movements.
So he was openly advocating for a double standard as a moral imperative.
Yes. Marcuse believed that giving a platform to conservative ideas was dangerous because it perpetuated oppression.
And Riker seizes on this.
Oh, absolutely. He claims that Marcuse's philosophy is the exact operational blueprint for the modern university.
When you see campus safe spaces, or when conservative guest speakers are deplatformed, shouted down, or disinvited, while radical left-wing ideologies are protected from any criticism, Riker argues you are watching repressive tolerance functioning exactly as Marcuse designed it.
It's not hypocrisy, it's the intended feature of the system.
It's one thing to say the philosophy changed, but Riker takes this a massive step further. He argues this ideological shift was fueled by a deliberate financial pivot.
He points the finger at major philanthropic organizations, specifically the Rockefeller and Ford foundations operating in the 1960s.
What exactly is the claim here regarding the funding of the sciences?
The book claims that these massive, immensely powerful foundations realized that to reshape society, they needed to reshape the universities.
So according to Riker, they deliberately began pulling massive amounts of grant money and funding away from the hard, objective sciences, things like physics, mechanical engineering, and pure mathematics.
And instead, they poured billions of dollars over the decades into creating and sustaining the soft sciences, sociology, and what he categorizes as grievance studies.
The text argues this wasn't just about exploring new academic fields, it was a deliberate strategy to weaponize academia against the masculine, results-oriented work ethic that originally built these institutions.
Right. If you fund engineering, you get bridges. If you fund critical theory, you get a vanguard of activists trained to dismantle the culture that built the bridge.
And to illustrate what he sees as the resulting intellectual bankruptcy of this multi-decade shift, Riker highlights a very famous event from 1996 known as the Sokol hoax.
This is a crucial piece of evidence in his argument.
The Sokol hoax is legendary. For listeners who haven't heard of this, Alan Sokal was a physics professor at New York University.
And he was deeply frustrated by the rise of postmodernism and critical theory in the humanities.
Yeah, that kind of academic writing that used incredibly dense, impenetrable jargon to say seemingly very little, while frequently misusing scientific concepts.
So Sokal decided to run an experiment. He wrote a paper titled Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity.
Which sounds incredibly sophisticated.
It sounds sophisticated, but Sokal intentionally wrote it as unadulterated, deliberate gibberish.
He just strung together buzzwords.
Buzzwords, flattering ideological claims, and absolute nonsense regarding physics. It made no logical sense whatsoever.
And he submitted it to a leading cultural studies journal called Social Text.
And they published it.
Unbelievable.
They published it in their special issue on the Science Wars. They didn't send it out for peer review by physicists. They accepted it because it sounded sophisticated. It used the correct academic jargon. And most importantly, it aligned perfectly with the editor's political and ideological biases against the objective nature of science.
And when Sokal revealed the hoax, it caused an earthquake in academia. Riker uses this to make a devastating comparison. He argues that modern feminist and critical theory academia functions essentially as a cargo cult.
That's a powerful metaphor. The term cargo cult comes from the Pacific Islands during and after World War II.
Right.
During the war, American and Japanese militaries set up airstrips on these remote islands, bringing in massive amounts of cargo food, jeeps, radios.
The indigenous people observed the soldiers marching, waving flags, talking into metal boxes, and then airplanes would drop from the sky with goods.
But when the war ended and the soldiers left, the cargo stopped. So some of the islanders began building airstrips out of bamboo. They carved wooden headsets and marched in formation, hoping to summon the airplanes back.
They replicated the outward aesthetics and rituals of the system without understanding the underlying mechanics or physics that actually made the system work.
And that is exactly what Riker says modern credentialism is. He claims universities are producing a simulacrum of intelligence.
They teach students to use complex jargon, to cite critical theorists, and to perform the rituals of academia, accepting absolute nonsense as profound truth as long as it signals the correct political allegiance.
But like the bamboo airplanes, it generates no actual value.
Which ties directly back to our earlier discussion about the death of the classical Trivium.
The book argues that by abandoning grammar and logic, universities systematically replaced the rigorous objective study of the Western canon thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas, who demanded structural integrity in thought with entirely subjective, fluid frameworks.
Frameworks like intersectionality. The book defines intersectionality as a framework that views society entirely through overlapping hierarchies of victimhood and systemic oppression, rather than individual merit or objective reality.
Right. When you replace the search for objective truth with the mandate to decolonize the mind, Riker argues you aren't educating students.
You're creating intellectual echo chambers designed to produce ideological compliance rather than wisdom.
And here's where the architecture of the book pivots from the philosophical to the macroeconomic.
Because if these institutions are producing cargo cult credentials, who is paying for it?
Riker looks at the massive, looming specter of the student loan crisis and frames it not as a policy failure, but as a deliberate, systematic wealth transfer mechanism.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's get into the math on this, because the numbers he presents are staggering.
He outlines a macroeconomic argument based on taxation and debt.
According to the text, men overwhelmingly dominate the high productivity, physically dangerous, and wealth-generating sectors of the economy. Here we're talking commercial construction, petroleum extraction, deep-sea welding, electrical grid maintenance, sanitation.
Heavy logistics. Because men are overwhelmingly performing these high-risk, high-yield jobs, the book claims that men contribute roughly 70 to 80% of the total income tax revenue collected by the state.
They are the primary engine of the tax base. So you have this massive influx of male-generated capital going into the state treasury. And where does the book claim it goes?
Well, Riker points out that women currently hold nearly 2/3 of the total student debt in the United States.
That is a collective sum of over $929 billion.
And the author connects these two data points to make a highly controversial claim. He argues that the government acts as a parasitic middleman.
It extracts heavy taxation from the productive masculine class, the guys keeping the power grid online, and uses that revenue to back, guarantee, or subsidize loans for non-productive, soft humanities degrees held primarily by women.
It's a direct pipeline. The plumber's taxes are guaranteeing the loan for the master's degree in sociology.
Right. But Riker pushes the analysis even further. He argues that this transferred wealth doesn't even go toward actual education in the traditional sense, doesn't buy microscopes or fund engineering labs,
Instead, it funds massive, bureaucratic administrative bloat.
and he brings up very specific data to hammer this point home. He cites the University of Michigan, noting that their diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI budget, has ballooned to over $30 million annually.
For the listener who might not be familiar, a DEI department is an administrative wing dedicated to enforcing diversity quotas, running bias training, and managing the cultural climate of the university.
Riker frames this $30 million expenditure as a literal diversity tax.
He argues it is money forcibly extracted from male taxpayers and male engineering students, specifically to fund the salaries of an expanding administrative class.
He provocatively refers to this demographic of administrators as an HR harem.
A heavily female-dominated bureaucracy that, according to his thesis, actively despises the very masculine culture and meritocracy that generated the wealth paying their salaries.
To explain how this functions on a national economic scale, he leans heavily into Austrian economics. Let's break this down for the listener. He references Ludwig von Mises.
One of the giants of the Austrian school, specifically his work on the nature of bureaucracy.
What is the Austrian perspective on this wealth transfer?
Ludwig von Mises argued that while private enterprise is driven by the profit motive, which requires efficiently serving consumer needs and creating actual value, bureaucracies operate entirely outside the market.
They don't generate wealth, they only consume it.
Right. They measure their success not by output, but by how much budget they can absorb and how many regulations they can enforce.
And Riker uses this to explain what he calls the GDP illusion.
If the government taxes that male tradesman $10,000 and then hands that $10,000 to a university to pay the salary of a female DEI administrator, the nation's gross domestic product mathematically goes up on paper.
Money changed hands, a salary was paid, economic activity was recorded.
But from the Austrian economic standpoint, no actual wealth was created.
The tradesman lost capital he could have used to expand his business or invest, and the administrator produced no tangible good or technological advancement.
Riker calls this a washing machine of money. It spins endlessly, generating paperwork, expanding administrative titles, and creating the illusion of a booming economy, while generating absolutely zero tangible value for human civilization.
It's economic circular motion disguised as progress.
Exactly.
The terrifying part of his thesis, for the target audience at least, is that this dynamic didn't stay contained within the ivy-covered walls of the university.
The book asserts that the ideologies incubated in academia have been aggressively exported into the corporate sector.
Riker argues that the modern corporate environment has been structurally altered to become incredibly hostile to men.
He claims this was achieved by weaponizing soft skills.
In a purely meritocratic, masculine industry like software engineering or logistics, the only thing that should matter is output. Does the code compile? Does the bridge hold the weight? Is the supply chain efficient?
But Riker argues that HR departments have redefined competence to prioritize things like empathy, inclusivity, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal consensus.
He views these soft skills not as beneficial workplace traits, but as Trojan horses used to infiltrate and control industries that should be based purely on logic and hard output.
And he provides several high-profile case studies to illustrate this corporate takeover. Let's look at the first one, the James Damore incident at Google in 2017.
This is a foundational text for the modern manosphere. James Damore was a software engineer at Google. After attending a mandatory diversity training program, he wrote an internal memo.
In that memo, he cited evolutionary psychology and biological literature to suggest that innate biological differences in interests between men and women might explain part of the gender disparity in the tech industry.
Specifically, that men generally prefer working with things, while women generally prefer working with people, rather than attributing the entire gap to systemic sexism and discrimination.
The fallout was immediate and explosive.
The memo went viral, there was immense internal outrage at Google, and Damore was fired for perpetuating gender stereotypes and creating a hostile work environment.
Riker uses this incident as absolute proof of his thesis. He argues that Damore attempted to use classical logic, data, and evolutionary biology to explain a phenomenon.
But in the modern corporate tribunal, governed by the HR class, objective scientific discourse is entirely subordinate to female feelings and ideological consensus.
To speak a statistical truth that causes emotional discomfort is now a fireable offense.
Riker contrasts Damore with his next case study, holding her up as the ultimate destructive archetype of female credentialism.
Elizabeth Holmes and the Theranos scandal.
This analysis is fascinating because of how he frames her aesthetics. Elizabeth Holmes famously claimed to have invented a machine that could run hundreds of complex medical tests on a single drop of blood.
She became a billionaire on paper, lauded on magazine covers as the next Steve Jobs.
But the machine never worked. It was a massive fraud.
Riker points out how Holmes operated. She brilliantly mimicked the visual and behavioral aesthetics of male competence.
She wore the Steve Jobs black turtleneck uniform to signal utilitarian focus.
She deliberately lowered her speaking voice to a baritone register to project masculine authority. She gathered a board of highly respected, older, credentialed men.
It's the cuttlefish strategy again.
Precisely. She bypassed the need to actually do the grueling physical science. Riker argues she operated entirely on rhetoric, skipping grammar and logic.
She believed that status projection, relentless networking, and social engineering were viable substitutes for hard scientific truth.
And the investor class, media and political elite, bought the illusion completely because they were desperate, ideologically, for a female tech founder archetype.
As the book points out, it highlights a fatal confusion between the map and the territory. Social manipulation and emotional persuasion work wonders in interpersonal dynamics and boardroom meetings.
But you cannot gaslight a molecule. You cannot emotionally manipulate the physics of a blood test. Eventually, reality asserts itself.
But the fact that she got so far, raising hundreds of millions of dollars on pure credential illusion, is Riker's point.
The book also includes a lighter, though incredibly biting anecdote to drive this point home on a micro level.
Riker describes a dinner party setting where he observes a woman who holds a master's degree in intersectional urban planning. During the party, the kitchen sink develops a serious leak. Water is pouring onto the floor.
Instead of just grabbing a wrench, shutting off the valve, and fixing the plumbing, engaging in direct mechanical problem solving, the woman attempts to use critical theory to analyze the situation.
She starts explaining how the bursting pipe is an expression of the infrastructure's frustration with the patriarchal top-down pressure of the municipal water grid.
The floorboards are actively being ruined, the drywall is soaking up water, while she stands there deconstructing the hydronormative oppression of the fixture.
Riker uses this dark comedy to illustrate a tragic reality. Higher credentials in the modern university system often correlate directly with a complete inability to operate within physical, mechanical reality.
The map has entirely replaced the territory in their minds.
But how did this worldview get codified into corporate law? Because HR departments didn't just wake up one day and decide to fire James Damore. They are operating under a legal framework.
The text traces this scaffolding back to a very specific moment in 1971, the Supreme Court decision in Griggs v. Duke Power Co.
I want to get into the weeds on the legal scaffolding here, because this is a massive piece of the puzzle.
It is the keystone of his legal argument. To understand why Riker views Griggs as a cataclysmic shift, we have to look at what corporate hiring was like in the 1960s under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act.
Before this ruling, the legal standard for proving discrimination was disparate treatment.
Meaning you had to prove actual malicious intent. If a company refused to hire someone, the plaintiff had to prove that the hiring manager actively and intentionally discriminated against them based on their race, gender, or religion.
You had to prove the mental intent to treat them disparately.
Correct. But Griggs v. Duke Power Co. changed the entire landscape. The Supreme Court ruled that a company's hiring practices could be deemed illegal if they resulted in a disparate impact, regardless of the employer's intent.
In other words, if a company institutes a completely neutral aptitude test for a job, say a spatial reasoning test for a mechanical position, and that test results in a statistically unequal demographic outcome where more men pass than women, the test itself is legally presumed to be discriminatory.
This statistical disparity in the outcome becomes the proof of discrimination, even if the test is perfectly objective and no malice was intended.
Yes, and Riker argues this single legal shift created a perpetual grievance trap.
It meant that corporations were suddenly terrified of objective aptitude testing or pure meritocracy because unequal outcomes are the natural result of biological differences and varied interests.
To protect themselves from massive lawsuits, corporations empowered HR departments to artificially manipulate hiring and firing to ensure statistical parity.
The book argues this legally mandates the penalization of competent men simply because the organic outcomes of their competence don't perfectly match the ideological quotas demanded by the state.
So we've explored the rigorous philosophical foundations, the macroeconomics of taxation and debt, and the legal takeover of the corporate world. But Riker doesn't leave it there.
He brings this immense theoretical framework down to the most intimate level of human existence.
How does this text claim all of this institutional capture affects the personal lives of everyday people? What does it do to the dating scene, to marriage, to the continuation of the species?
This brings us to the book's highly clinical perspective on the dissolution of the nuclear family. The text introduces a concept it calls the genetic dead-end statistic.
Relying on demographic data from sources like the OECD and various sociological surveys, Riker points out a harsh, unavoidable biological reality.
There is a direct inverse correlation between a woman's educational level and her fertility rate.
Put simply, the more credentials a woman acquires, the more time she spends in the university system accumulating master's degrees and doctorates, the less likely she is to have children and actually replace herself in the gene pool.
Riker illustrates the psychological toll of this statistic with a poignant, deeply tragic archetype he calls the tragedy of Dr. Emily.
Dr. Emily is 38 years old. She has done everything society told her to do. She sacrificed her 20s to study, she navigated the brutal politics of academia in her 30s, and she finally receives her tenure letter, securing the ultimate academic status.
But the scene he paints is devastating. She is sitting alone in her office, clutching that tenure letter, while simultaneously on the phone scheduling her third agonizing round of IVF treatments.
The book paints this picture of a woman having a sudden, terrifying realization that her citation index, her published papers, and her professional titles cannot replace a genetic legacy.
She realizes she traded her prime biological fertility years for a paper economy that cannot keep her warm or visit her in a nursing home.
This leads directly into the book's very stark, unsparing analysis of the modern sexual marketplace. Riker argues that the modern university system doesn't just extract wealth, it actively encourages women to waste their peak fertility years, their early to mid-20s, on what he crudely terms the cock carousel.
Let's unpack the mechanics of what he means by that, because he ties it to a concept called hypergamy.
Hypergamy is the sociological term for the instinct to date across and up the social hierarchy seeking a mate who is taller, richer, or higher status than oneself.
Right. Riker claims that universities cluster thousands of young women together and culturally encourage them to chase the top 10% of high-status men. The elite athletes, the charismatic cads, the wealthy frat presidents.
These top-tier men have abundant options, and therefore have absolutely zero intention of committing or settling down in their 20s.
So women spend their most fertile years in short-term, unfulfilling relationships with men they cannot lock down.
And according to the text, the technology of modern dating apps only acts as an accelerant to this fire. Riker describes a phenomenon he calls the Cheesecake Factory effect.
If you've ever looked at a menu at the Cheesecake Factory, it's 30 pages long. There are so many options that you suffer from decision paralysis, and whatever you eventually order, you wonder if you should have gotten something else.
Riker argues dating apps do exactly this to women's psychology. Because the app gives them the illusion of infinite global choice, they suffer from constant dissatisfaction. They always believe a better, taller, wealthier man is just one swipe away.
And here is where the credentialism ties back in. As their credentials inflate, as they get the master's and the PhD, their hypergamy intensifies.
They feel they have increased their value, so they raise their standards for a mate even higher. They refuse to settle for the reliable, average Dave, the sanitation worker, or the tradesman who would be a loyal father, because their degrees make them feel intellectually and socially superior to him.
Yet the top-tier men they desire still won't commit. The result is a generation of highly educated, profoundly lonely women who age out of the mating market.
This raises the crucial, practical question of the entire text. What is the author's proposed solution for men trying to navigate this landscape? If the corporate world is a grievance trap and the dating market is broken by hypergamy and credentialism, what is a man to do?
Riker introduces a concept he calls waitress wisdom.
He explicitly advises men to seek out the undegreed woman. The argument here is completely countercultural.
He suggests that a woman without a massive burden of student debt, and crucially, a woman who has not been subjected to 4 to 8 years of Marxist indoctrination and critical theory at a university, is far more likely to possess traditional domestic virtues, agreeableness, and a desire to build a family.
He advocates for a strict return to what he calls the captain and first mate marital dynamic.
In this framework, the man is the captain of the ship. He sets the overarching course for the family, handles the external defense, and provides the primary resources.
The woman acts as the first mate, managing the internal operations of the household, raising the children, and supporting the captain's vision.
The book strongly, even vehemently, argues against the modern egalitarian myth of the power couple, where two highly educated, high-earning careerists try to seamlessly merge their lives.
Riker claims these arrangements are inherently unstable, pointing to divorce rates among dual-income, highly educated couples that often exceed 50%.
He argues it just becomes a competitive, exhausting merger of two egos, leading to constant negotiation, gridlock, and eventual resentment because neither party is willing to submit to the other's vision.
So, having outlined the massive, multi-tiered scope of the problem as the author sees it, from the philosophical decay to the economic extraction to the biological dead ends, we must finally look at the defensive strategies he proposes. How does the book instruct its readers to actually fight back against this overwhelming system?
What does this all mean for the listener who buys into this worldview? The text outlines very specific, highly tactical rules of engagement.
Riker starts at the conversational level, analyzing the linguistic guerrilla warfare used against men, specifically focusing on terms like mansplaining.
He traces the origin of the concept of mansplaining back to a well-known essay by Rebecca Solnit.
Riker views this term not as a valid critique of male arrogance, but as a deliberate, weaponized tactic designed to bypass logical debate.
If a man is using grammar and logic presenting objective facts and syllogisms, and a woman realizes she is losing the argument on the merits, she can respond by accusing him of mansplaining or policing his tone.
It's an ad hominem defense. It attacks the speaker's identity and delivery, rather than addressing the substance of the argument.
Precisely. To counter this, the author advises men to study and utilize Arthur Schopenhauer's stratagems for dialectical combat. Specifically, how to win an argument when the opponent abandons logic.
For example, if accused of mansplaining, Riker advises using Schopenhauer's tactic of admitting the premise but denying the conclusion.
You look the accuser in the eye and say, "Yes, I am explaining facts to you because you appear to be misinformed, but I reject your conclusion that the transmission of objective knowledge is inherently toxic or patriarchal." You refuse to accept their moral framing of the interaction.
Moving from conversation to the corporate environment, the book recommends a very specific workplace survival tactic called the Gray Rock Protocol.
This is crucial for men who have to survive in HR-dominated environments to pay their bills. The protocol is exactly what it sounds like.
If a man is dealing with an HR department, a DEI officer, or a highly ideological colleague, he must show absolutely zero emotion.
You treat every single interaction as a purely transactional data exchange. You do not joke. You do not share personal details about your weekend. You do not engage in political banter. You document everything in writing. You record meetings where it is legally permissible.
And crucially, Riker emphasizes that you must never ever apologize if you have stated an objective fact.
Even if someone claims to be deeply offended by the fact, an apology in the modern corporate tribunal is not accepted as a polite gesture of goodwill. It is immediately logged as a formal confession of guilt and used to terminate you.
You just become as uninteresting, unresponsive, and unmovable as a gray rock.
Yeah.
You give them nothing to use against you.
But the Gray Rock Protocol is just a temporary survival mechanism. The ultimate call to action in the book goes far beyond just surviving the office. Riker advocates for a macro strategy he calls starve the beast.
And the primary mechanism for this is weaponized tax avoidance.
The logic here is intense, tying back to the economic wealth transfer we discussed earlier.
Since the book argues that the gynocentric welfare state, the system funding the useless degrees and the administrative bloat, is funded almost entirely by male tax dollars, Riker urges men to legally minimize their tax footprint to the absolute maximum extent possible.
He tells his readers to live cheaply, well below their means, utilize every single legal tax loophole available, move to states with zero income tax, structure your businesses to retain capital, protect your assets fiercely from potential divorce courts using trusts.
The philosophy is simple. Every single dollar legally denied to the state treasury is a dollar denied to the academic industrial complex. You are cutting off the blood supply to the parasite.
He also explicitly references Ayn Rand's magnum opus, Atlas Shrugged, specifically the concept of going galt.
In Rand's novel, the most productive members of society, the inventors, the industrialists, realize the system is feeding off them while punishing their excellence, so they deliberately go on strike and disappear, letting the world collapse.
Riker urges highly competent men today, the engineers, the master builders, the innovators, to quietly quit or completely withdraw their cognitive labor from woke corporations.
The argument is purely rational within his framework. If the corporate system actively punishes merit, prioritizes demographic quotas over competence, and creates a hostile environment for the men actually generating the value, the only logical choice is to stop providing your irreplaceable merit to that system.
Let the false, credentialed structure collapse under its own weight of inefficiency and incompetence.
And that withdrawal leads to the culmination of the book, his ultimate utopian vision, which he calls the citadel of meritocracy.
Riker envisions a near future where the men who have ghosted the Matrix use their suppressed capital and competence to build decentralized, male-led city-states.
These citadels are imagined as entirely parallel societies. They would be built on cryptocurrency networks to completely bypass the state banking system and inflation.
They would prioritize physical competence, technical mastery, and a strict return to the classical trivium for the education of their youth.
It's not just a political movement. It's a complete physical and economic withdrawal from captured institutions to build civilization from the ground up, based purely on objective reality and merit.
It is a sweeping, radical conclusion to a sweeping, radical book.
It really is.
If we connect this vision to the broader architecture we've explored today, it presents a fascinating, albeit extreme, logical conclusion to the author's premise. Which brings me to a final, profound thought for you to consider. Something that isn't explicitly answered in the text, but is deeply implied by its trajectory.
Lay it on us.
If Riker's premise is taken to its ultimate conclusion, and the most productive men fully ghosted the Matrix to build these parallel, decentralized citadel economies, what happens to the concept of a shared societal reality? Can a civilization truly survive, or even function on a basic logistical level, if its men and women exist in entirely separate intellectual, economic, and moral ecosystems?
That is an incredibly heavy, profound question to leave you with, and it really highlights the massive stakes of the arguments presented in this text. Again, our role today was to act strictly as impartial analysts, laying out the intricate architecture of these polarizing ideas so you can deeply understand the worldview driving this specific cultural movement. If you want to read the raw, unfiltered arguments for yourself and delve into this incisive, provocative perspective on our institutions, you need to read this book.
Highly recommended.
Please remember to like and subscribe to our audio feed so you never miss a deep dive into the ideas shaping our world. And definitely check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to purchase Credentialism Crisis, Women's False Economy of Education, so you can explore the primary source.
And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to see his ongoing analysis and commentary.
Thank you so much for exploring this complex terrain with us, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.